Hello, and welcome to Secure Talk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Secure Talk. As always, I'm delighted to have you join us today. We have an exceptional guest to chat with, a topic area that I'm deeply interested in and wanting to learn more about. Today, we're joined by Mary D'Angelo. She is a cyber threat intelligence lead for Searchlight Cyber. Mary is a deep expert in connecting the dark web with threat intelligence, and today we'll be exploring both. Mary, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Excellent. Mary, we have some early in career listeners, and a lot of the questions that we get quite a bit is how people that we interview got into the positions that they are. And I am always a little interested in kind of early in life influences, maybe before college. Was threat intelligence part of your interests prior to college, or was it something you learned about later?
It's kind of interesting. I kind of stumbled into this. I actually had no idea what threat intelligence was. I had no idea I would be in cybersecurity as a whole, but I think it was just something, I guess in the way that I grew up, technology just seemed like something I would never be at. But fortunately, just how things unraveled, and generally it was my first job getting out of undergrad, working at Darktrace, was I exposed to, cybersecurity. And that's when I really fell in love with, the community, and the folks, and just the entire landscape.
What did you study in college?
Oh my God, I kept changing my major. So I was psychology. I was, I think it was biology. And then I ended up doing marketing. For me, I didn't really know, it's just so hard when you're in undergrad. You have no idea what you want to do for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So I spent the majority of my time on campus actually being involved with different leadership activities.
Okay.
I was really, really big in that part, and connecting with, I created this pipeline between Deloitte and Accenture to do network recruiting with university students at the time. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you're in good company. I'm a theater grad. So, but a 25-year career in building software and startups. Yeah, so it was a big shift. Darktrace is a pretty amazing company, still growing quite quickly. And it was your first job. It must have been an incredible exposure to all aspects of security.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't know. There was a lag. Yeah, so I started with Darktrace right after undergrad. So I moved from Seattle, Washington to Washington, D.C. to help open their office in D.C., Northern Virginia at the time. This was way before they went public. They were so much smaller at the time, very, very startup-y. I think there was only about 5 of us that opened up the Washington, D.C. office. By the time I left, there was around 60 of us. And that got me, and this was also pre-pandemic too, so we were flying around, meeting customers, CISOs, CIOs, director of ITs, and going to all sorts of conferences at the time. And that gave me that first exposure to cybersecurity. And so I was with them for about 5 or 6 years until they IPO'd. Mm-hmm. And then one of my mentors, recommended I work for Searchlight, where I'm at right now, in dark web threat intelligence, and I absolutely had no idea what that was. I knew it abstractly what dark web threat intelligence was, but really didn't know it from a practical level. And then I think sort of what was more pivotal in my career was when I was invited to speak at a think tank in Germany. It was around cognitive vulnerabilities and social engineering. They wanted someone to talk about dark web threat intelligence and how threat actors are using it to, facilitate their operations. So
yeah, let's start on the dark web side. So I want to say I have a little bit of experience playing around, but I'm a naturally curious person about especially technology and the internet, which I spent most of my career trying to build. Let's just start with the mechanics. What is the dark web? Why would we even separate it from the rest of the internet in our mind?
Yeah. So like how I like to sort of define the dark web. So basically the dark web is where you can gain access into the internet where it's anonymous, right? And you don't have to, it's secure, anonymous, private, but you have to download certain software to gain access into it. Whereas clear web and deep web, you don't need to download any type of software. Most commonly used software is Tor, Tor spells the onion router. There are other types of software, but it's not quite commonly used. And so I think just to define the three, just so there's an understanding of the context as a whole, surface web is anything you can find on your standard, Google browser, right?
Okay.
Deep web may not necessarily be not indexed, right? But it doesn't require a Tor browser to gain access into, but it's incredibly hard to find. And that's where the majority of the internet is. I think it's about 90% of the internet is deep web. And that would be medical files, sites in Reddit, App Chat, Telegram, Discord, 8chan, 4chan, those types of areas. And then dark web is where the Tor browser comes into play. And so how that sort of works is, so it stands for the onion router. It's basically volunteer run nodes, like an interlay of nodes where traffic runs through the entry, middle, and exit nodes. And between each layer it drops a layer of decryption so that each node that you're in, the traffic will not know the entry and the exit, only one. And so that allows it to be fully anonymous and fully secure and private for those who want to get access into it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is really helpful. In my mind, a kind of clear web is a site that I would want indexed. And obviously we know so often I engage the internet through a search engine to find some piece of information that I'm looking for. But I can remember back in the day, a long time ago, what you termed deep web would have been maybe a site or a server I set up with just an IP address, non-indexed, right? So it's not going to come up in a search. But if I shared the IP address with someone, they'd be able to go hit that server and communicate with it.
Yep, exactly. And so if you think about like medical files, or financial, files, most of that time it's very secure, hard to gain access into, but you don't need special software to gain access into it.
Right. So included in the deep web would be things that are behind a login or some form of encryption that you have to access to get into those systems. Is that right?
Yes.
Then, if I remember correctly, I think Tor was originally developed to get around the Great Firewall. Is that right? We were looking for anonymous access to information around kind of political regimes trying to reduce access to information.
Yeah, so it's funny. The foundation of it, or the genesis of it, was really it was for a good thing, right? It was to help those in stricter regimes to have a voice, especially for journalists. But really, it was founded by the U.S. Navy. So it was the Naval Research Labs, created in the 90s to help to protect their intelligence agents. So they had a public and private and secure. But of course, obviously, since then it's devolved from then on. But there is still good components of it. I think I will say, though, sadly, I think only less than 1% of the dark web is used for whistleblowing and journalistic activities. But that is a main use case of why it was created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And to help that work, right, you mentioned Tor, the onion router, which is almost like a peer-to-peer network, a shared system. So you can bounce your activity off of other people and reduce the ability to understand what data is being asked for, where it's coming from, and where it's going, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there's no search engine for the dark web, right? Like you have to know exactly what server you want to hit that server. Like you have to understand the URL or whatever the right name is for that.
There's some types of search engines like that people have created within the dark web that it's not like what you would think with Google. But yeah, for the most part, in order to gain access to a certain site, you have to know and the sites are called onions. So you have to know the .onion sites to gain access into it. So even then, if you have access, then you also have to know where to look for to get it, if for whatever activities you're trying to do.
Yeah. It's been a clearinghouse for a while for things that were illicit, non-legal. I remember back to the Silk Road days and the Silk Road takedown. It seems like, just like other places in the web where we might have a community or a forum or places where people connect, we're doing that on the dark web, but with a set of content that we don't want exposed, or we want to be deeply anonymous. Is that right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. So it's most of the time, I mean, I like to think of it as like a criminal hub underground, right? So they have secure communications, they're totally private, anonymous, and they can chat with one another, take part in marketplaces, things like that.
Yeah, it's the dark alley of the internet.
Yeah.
That's the word, the dark web. Yeah. It seems that, especially for criminal activity, it's gotten a lot more activity. What are some of the types of things that criminals, threat actors are using the dark web for?
Yeah, so I can say the top 3 things that we see. So we track this, but it's always changing. It's always evolving and changing. But as of right now, the first is drugs, right? Guns and drugs. And so, I mean, you probably already know that. You probably hear that all the time. But it's famous for selling drugs, and then it's very lucrative. Make a lot of money with that as well. The second most important thing is data theft or identity theft. So you can think of it, social security numbers, credit card information.
Yeah.
Like irrelevant recently with AT&T leakage, that was like 70 million, I think it's like customers' information, private information. I think it was current customers and former customers combined. From a hack that happened 5 years ago that they just recently leaked onto the dark web. But those types of things, and that's extremely lucrative on the dark web. And then thirdly, it would have to do with hacker services or, ransomware as a service, or, buying different types of exploits, things like that really have increased ransomware within the last couple of years or so.
Yeah. I can think of a number of different recent major breaches where we learned about it from activity on the dark web, like 23andMe. It seems like there was the sale of data there, and that's how we learned of the breach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you ever help organizations understand kind of what the market value is of themselves? And is the dark web a part of understanding that value?
Yeah. So I think in terms of, or we mean the value of threat intelligence? Sure.
Or even the data itself, right? It seems quite surprising sometimes to realize that there's a going rate for a record.
Yeah. I think and that's also kind of hard to, a lot of times when you're dealing with customers or those who are just getting into threat intelligence, they have a hard time understanding, okay, so yeah, my emails have been leaked. I don't care. That's 5 years ago. Right. But it's so much more to that. And it's about, for us, it's about the pre-attack side. So if this is the criminal underground, these are where the ransomware groups and threat actors are hanging out. They're discussing, maybe new vulnerabilities they found, selling different types of exploits or credentials or types of access they have to organizations. And they might not be saying explicitly what organization they have, maybe the industry as a whole. But if you're able to monitor and track all of those different indicators, then you are able to know as an organization, okay, I need to be, this is where my weakness is. This is what I need to prioritize. This is where I need to fund in terms of like security aspects.
Yeah. Let's talk about that phrase pre-attack a little bit, because I think in our work, certainly like security posture management has been important, but you guys are much more focused on actual emerging threats in your work. Is that right?
Yeah. So we do both. So we do pre-attack intelligence and also post-mortem. Obviously, we prefer to do the pre-attack. But basically, So if if you feel familiar with the minor attack framework and the cyber kill chain, the different steps a threat actor takes to complete their objectives. And usually companies don't get alerted until I think it's like stage 3 or stage 5 within the cyber attack framework or kill chain. And with, dark web threat intelligence, we're really trying to shift left of boom. So usually at the reconnaissance phase, when threat actors are doing their research, when they're exploring, when they're trying to find vulnerabilities, when they are selling different credentials, different types of access that they have, having all of that visibility is then really can help stop the threat actors so that they would have to start all over again from the beginning, cutting it off right there and then. And then also on the postmortem side, so like incident response, let's say you were, unfortunately, you were hit with an attack. Okay, well, what was the genesis of the attack? How did this start? Was it credentials that were leaked? Were there any sort of indications of discussions that would be related to this? So things like that you could, that you'd be able to investigate afterwards and to build a better, more context understanding around how the attack happened.
Yeah, I love that phrase, left of boom. That's really a great turn of phrase.
So, it's very military.
Yes, that's good. Well, I've talked with a lot of guests, and I think that especially when you're dealing with threat intelligence or intelligence broadly, there is a military aspect to the work, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've noticed that too a lot. Most of my writing, I think it's because a lot of the folks that come from threat intelligence come from a military background, and so they bring that with them. It's really interesting, actually, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
So do you guys is it strange to be behind enemy lines on some level? You're operating in the spaces where the attack is perhaps being decided upon, or what the vectors of attack might be, or what the surface area to go after. It's got to feel a little, I just imagine the hairs on my skin standing up as I'm sitting in the space. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is a little scary in the sense that because I set up different alerts within the platform. So basically, collecting the dark web threat intelligence into a platform. And so I set up alerts to see, what initial access brokers are selling. And it's crazy what initial access brokers are selling on there and how, and there's also a lot of insider threat as well. So people trying to poach, employees from different organizations to give up some type of credential access that they have. But they have, their TTPs, they all have their own. It's very similar in the sense it hasn't evolved too much in how they request for this information or how they're selling this information. So you can kind of, and that's where it helps us, right? So usually an initial access broker is selling, let's say they're selling credentials. They won't, they know people are monitoring the dark web. So they're not going to name the company that they have credentials for, but they'll say the revenue size and the industry and maybe the type of access they have. So whether that be RDP, VPN, or maybe exploited vulnerability. And then with that information, then that's how we can kind of narrow down, okay, who's the company they're targeting. But yeah, it's insane. There's a lot of filtering out as well.
Yeah. It's a lucrative business, right? That's why we see so much a continued increase in activity around this. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think last year, the ransomware groups made, in terms of payments, around 1.1 billion ransomware payments, which is the highest ever. Which is really scary, though, because if you think about it, oftentimes when you're on the dark web, you see that there's millions of different exploits that are being sold, or there's many credentials that are being sold. Now that these ransomware groups have this large sum of money, bigger budget, how much more can they purchase, right? Like how much more can they recruit? And so it is a very booming and very scary business.
When we think about the data being sold, one of the things that I think too often we think about these things in isolation, but let's say I wanted to buy a record or a series of records that's very private information. I think that this leads to other hacks that are available, right? Social engineering type hacks. This type of private information gets me that ability, right?
Oh yeah, it's all related. So I think with like the MGM attack with Scattered Spider, that was both related on, it was, I think, mostly phishing, but then some sort of credentials that might have been sold on the dark web that then they gained access into, then to do the phishing attempt. So it's all intertwined with each other, and that's how the market works, though. So there's no longer just someone doing, you have ransomware as a service, you have initial access broker, and so you understand the market well, then you're able to really profit from it.
I think early, as things like this were emerging, there was a lot of blaming of nation states as going after infrastructure, but it's turned into much more business, I think, lately than this idea that, it's a funded nation state wanting to attack another nation state or the commercial interests of a nation state.
Yeah, I do like to be very clear with the distinction between state-sponsored nation-state actors and criminal ransomware groups, because they are distinctly different. They have very different goals, different agendas, and their tactics are different as well because their resources are different. Nation-state actors tend to have much larger budgets, better pool of people to recruit from, whereas, your average criminal ransomware group, they're just going to do anything to get a quick buck. So whatever is easy, they would go after the low-hanging fruit. That's not to say, though, that a nation-state actor, is moonlighting and doing criminal ransomware groups, at nighttime. Like, we're not quite sure how deep that relationship is, but so I wouldn't say it's completely separate. But I do want to acknowledge the difference between the two.
Yeah. We saw the Lockbit, for example, it seems more like a commercial enterprise, but incredibly resilient. They were back quite quickly. Yeah.
That was, I don't want to talk about that too much, but it was an interesting series of events.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is compounded the growth of the dark web or its utilization has been cryptocurrency availability. Do you agree, like, the ability to transfer funds has been critical to, I think, the criminal element being successful?
Oh, yeah, undoubtedly. I think it's been really, well, for the first part, it's decentralized, right? So authorities have a hard time freezing accounts or going after certain accounts. And so when you're dealing with threat actors, they're all about anonymity and privacy. So that helps them. And just the nature of it being global, right? You don't have to exchange any sort of, currency rates. It's used all over the world. And the barrier of entry is pretty low now, especially as the technology for crypto gets improved. It's easier for people to get access into it and start using it. So it's definitely amplified dark web activity.
It's funny because I think with an exposed ledger, like I think about things like Bitcoin and things like that, you'd think, there's a lot more traceability of the funds, but everyone's so anonymous on the other end, on either end of the payment receipt situation, that just because you can see the fund transfer doesn't mean you can actually enact some law enforcement, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly hard. It's really, really hard to enforce, and especially layering that on top of with threat actors using the anonymity around dark web.
What do you think about the future of the dark web itself? Where do you see the utilization of this technology going, and how do we prepare for those changes?
Yeah, so I can see it's kind of, in some ways, it's good when law enforcement, if say the takedown of Lockbit, law enforcement will kind of say some of the reasons as to why they were taken down. Mostly it has to do with careless activity with the threat actors. Maybe they left just some clear sign of who they were, right? But these threat actors follow all that. They're watching all of this. And so they're looking at the reports. They know they're being watched. And so then they change their tactics. And so it makes it more difficult to find them. And as they're under, more and more scrutiny, they're getting really smarter of, trying to evade law enforcement. So a lot of times we see a lot of push to Telegram as well. A lot of criminal activity happening within Telegram, just because of that, of course, that secure communication. But I guess, I mean, really just to be on top of it is just to really, I mean, my biggest thing is intelligence driven organizations, right? And I mean that as in not just from company to company, because that's important too, right? So if I am oil and gas, I want to make sure I'm sharing my intel with other oil and gas sectors, because everyone is so siloed. They always just keep your intel to each other. But then also within the organization. So threat intelligence shouldn't be strictly with just cyber threat intelligence, the CTI team. It should be with, the pen testers. It should be with incident response. It should be with the SOC folks. Sharing that intel, because that's how to make threat intelligence most effective. So I think sort of in how we could combat this with some of the changes that we're going to be seeing, especially as these ransomware groups become more profitable, more successful, is really, really being on top of it and being very threat intelligence driven.
Yeah. I think it's really an emerging practice for cybersecurity professionals in a way. I mean, I think it's certainly been around for a little while, but it's been so hard to recover from attack that I do think more of the emphasis being put on, to your point, the pre-attack work, and the threat intelligence. Are there communities that are forming in certain industries to share this type of intelligence? Is that movement being successful?
Yes, I do see it. I do see it with certain sectors. They'll have Slack channels or sort of like miniature conferences that they get together to share some of this. But I think it could definitely get better. It's something that I'm trying to hopefully help within the next couple months or so.
Well, that's excellent. Well, when you think about threat intelligence as a practice, obviously there are all different sizes of organizations, and we're seeing more organizations of maybe a sub 1,000 employee be impacted by something like ransomware. Where do you think threat intelligence kind of belongs in the maturity of an organization? Is it more important when you're big enough to be, a real target, or are there things that smaller organizations can do to be aware earlier on?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's true. Like if I was just looking through some of the initial access broker things, some of the credentials they were selling, and most of the time the revenue size was way less than billing, right? You're really thinking like mid-market. Also, low, as I mentioned, they like to go after the low-hanging fruit, what's the easiest. And so there's certainly a need for that market to have threat intelligence, right? Because it's important for them to be aware. If someone has domain access control credentials being sold, for your organization, you would want to be aware of that, right? Or if someone in your organization is like insider risk or insider threat associated is giving up, gets an ad from someone trying to request information about their organization. That's important to know about. But then at the same time, it's security teams are already so strapped, and it's so hard to manage everything that they have to do. We talk about alert fatigue, but on top of all that, managing threat intelligence as well. And because that does require, we kind of make it as much as automated as possible, right? So that when you are receiving alerts, they are relevant, timely, and they're actionable. But it does require work. And I think sophisticated teams have a much better understanding of it. Plus, they have folks who have done, cyber threat intelligence is rather new, and they're able to recruit people that have been experienced in threat intelligence, as opposed to, if you're just, all you've done is SOC, and now you're being pulled into tracking these different ransomware groups, indicators. It becomes difficult. So there's definitely a need there. I'm not sure if maybe that might need to be outsourced a little bit, into MSSPs to help them out. But certainly I think I think of hospitals in general, they really need this type of visibility.
Yeah. Those records, we had a customer at StrikeCraft that was in the health services space, and they did an analysis of the value of their records. And I think, they weren't doing more than 10 million in revenue, but their small record footprint that they had, which wasn't very big at all, they priced at about 70 million by looking on forums of the dark web for what the going rate for a record was. Yeah, which really surprised them. They did not have an idea of how valuable that data was. I think it's one of the first misconceptions, right, Mary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's super lucrative. So, I mean, that's the number. I think that's the number 2 thing that's being sold most profitable on the dark web is those types of data sets.
Yeah. When you think about threat intelligence broadly, I like the idea that you could work with a managed security services provider to help you. What is some of the things that a customer of Searchlight Cyber or anyone they're going to engage around threat intelligence, what do they need to know about themselves to have a really effective engagement with a team like yours?
Yeah, so I think, so we do like monitoring, right? So we're trying to do, again, when it comes to pre-attack, basically, so we have an understanding of some of the TTPs of the threat actors, their tactics, techniques, procedures. And so if they can just let us know, their industry is really important for us, the name of the organization's domains, email addresses, we can track all of that. But then we're also looking, as I mentioned, from an industry-wide, so seeing company, how their competitors are within the space. Their credentials are being sold or if they're being discussed in different forums. Because there's also different layers within the dark web as well. So you have one layer that's strictly for ransomware groups and threat actors, and you have to have a certain credentials authorization level to gain access into it. We do have a human intelligence team that can go undercover and gain access into some of these sites. So to pull that. So just because you have access to the dark web doesn't necessarily mean you have access to everything. There's certainly a lot of private groups that you would need to gain access into. So basically, from an organization perspective, it's just just having a broad understanding of their company. Maybe if they want to monitor their C levels, things like that. You sort of usually just like industry and brand name.
Yeah. That's a great thing to bring up is there's a dark web. Some of these spaces are invite only practically for that you can even get into it, right?
Oh yeah. And those are the places where you would want are the most important, the highest priority. Because oftentimes, I think I was working with this organization once and they were hacked. And they were waiting they didn't pay the ransom. And they were waiting, just monitoring the dark web, just waiting to see when their data would be exposed. And I'm like, well, probably it's going to be a while because at this point, your data is being sold in these different private groups, right? It's being passed around these different private groups. And in fact, that point, that all of those deals have been done, then the leftovers, they would release it out to the public. So sometimes, really, after you've been attacked, it can take like a couple months, maybe years, until that data is actually released to the dark web. And you don't know at that point who else has had access to it as well. So that's kind of a little bit scary to think about, but yeah, it exists.
Yeah, I think it's not zero, but it's a pretty infinitesimal sum to create a duplicate of the data and resell it again for even a lower amount. And I can see how there are higher profile markets that fresher data gets a higher dollar value. And as you have utilized those markets, you might move into other markets to sell the same set of data.
Yeah. I think we had a client, they were so excited because it's months since the attack. And they were like, oh my gosh, nothing's been leaked yet. And I'm like, no, believe me. These criminal groups they're not trying to be gracious here. They're trying to make as much money as they can with that information now before they leak it out to the public. So
yeah,
sad, but true.
And they have plenty of time. once the data is exfiltrated, I was talking with a colleague about LastPass, and we were talking about the time it took to essentially break into certain vaults, and that because the data was exfiltrated, they can play with it for as long as they want. They're not on the clock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Mary, all this stuff is a little dark. But I do think that perhaps we as security professionals can be more precise in our responses or what we're aware of by understanding what threat actors are doing, right? I mean, broadly, I think from a building a better society, you're delivering intelligence that can help us be more aware or better prepared for an attack.
Right. And it is difficult because there are so many large ransomware groups out there, criminal ransomware groups out there, not to mention the state-sponsored groups. And so it does require effort to knowing who these are, what their TTPs are, who they try to go after, what industry, what sector they're looking after. But if you're able to get that intelligence and sort of like, there's a little bit of overhead to start, but once that's done with, then it can just be more of a monitoring phase. Then it becomes extremely useful. And that's when I'm like, okay, now we need to share this. And now that CTI has it, now we need to share it with the SOC team, the response, red team, whatever, leadership.
Excellent. Well, I'm super grateful, Mary, for you joining us today. It's been a lot for me to learn. I'm really grateful for it. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great being here.